Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I'm looking back over a previous sort of Booker shortlist, as I've been doing as part of my little challenge to read all of the shortlists of the Booker Prize. But this one has a sort of special relevance in that it was recently my birthday, and this is the one from my birth year of 1989. And yeah, let's see how this goes, because it feels very strange because in some ways, I like to think of myself as young. And then I look at a list like this, I'm like, wow, I have not heard of many of these books. Well, I hadn't heard of many of them before before going into this. But anyway, let's get started. I'm not that old, really. I say, I hope. Who knows? But yeah, anyway, let's look at the 1989 Booker Prize shortlist. So I'll start off with the winner and then go on to the other shortlisted authors by surname in alphabetical order. But we start with one of my favourite Booker winners, Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. And this is a book where we follow a butler who served a wealthy family as he looks back over his time having been a butler. And at first this sort of sounds like it might be, you know, very focused in that very specific kind of way of, you know, him being sort of slightly out of touch. But I think the real sort of dexterity, I guess, of this novel, the really sort of tender, soft, kind of clever perception of this novel is in the ways that lots is left unsaid, and we suddenly realise, or slowly realise rather, as the book goes on, more and more how oblivious the butler has been about some things that have been going on, and or the butler isn't kind of fully recognising everything that is there. There's something in his perception of everything that's going on where he is intentionally not looking in a certain place. So we follow as he sort of goes back and he sort of sees his former life, and, you know, he sort of thinks back to, you know, a woman who he worked with at the time that he sort of wants to rekindle some kind of friendship or potentially relationship with. And she, in some ways, is sort of in the place of the reader. She's the one saying, actually, buddy, I think you'll find these other things were not quite as good as you thought they were. And she's sort of a voice of reason here, because what we realise increasingly is that this rich family who had him as a butler were involved in quite a few bits of politics around the world wars, and particularly World War II, and this kind of, you know, that we sort of learn about sort of various political figures being invited to the house at specific times, and actually we sort of can unpick that these maybe weren't necessarily the good guys, but this sense of duty that the butler has to the family means that he often can't see those. There's also something really interesting there about how his sense of duty really impacts other parts of the narrative. So we don't necessarily always know if we can trust parts of how he sees things. You know, he'll refer to, you know, he's got a very specific way of everything working, and sometimes he can't quite understand that other people don't work that way. So he'll talk about, oh, well, of course this person left. It was the right thing because, you know, they weren't doing their job properly. And actually sort of we kind of get the sense that there was more going on underneath that. And he's the one who's been a stick in the mud and hasn't understood either times changing or kind of other people's needs. And actually that idea of time changing is really interesting because he's held on to this sense of identity as being a butler, and this is a really formative part of who he is, and he can't necessarily unpick that. And I think this book is such a fascinating character study as a result of that. And I think this is you know, just a fabulous bit of writing. This is a book that made me fall in love with Ishiguro ages ago, and yeah, I just really love this book. Next up, we have Margaret Atwood with Cat's Eye. And in many ways, this book sort of naturally sits alongside something like The Remains of the Day thematically. It involves a lot of somebody looking back over their life and trying to understand various aspects of it. And the thing I found really fascinating about this, you know, so Atwood is an author who I love, and this is one of those books by Atwood that some people absolutely love and some people struggle a little bit more with. I still really enjoyed it. I didn't necessarily struggle with it in a big way. I just think some of her other books maybe sang to me slightly better. But what I will say, this book, I think she is she's such a master at being able to look back at memories. And I really love writing about memories anyway, and kind of the various ways that they're clouded or obscured. And I think there's something really beautiful about this character at the heart of it, Elaine Risley, who is a painter, and she is looking back over her life because she's basically about to have a retrospective that is talking about all of her life. And she starts remembering all these little details, which I found really fascinating, actually, because she has these little things about Cat's Eye the Marble. That's sort of where the book gets its title. But there's something in there about this kind of cruelty that she experiences. There's this sort of she sort of, school can be a cruel time for many people anyway. But there's something in the way this book is done that really, I think, captures that sort of childhood power struggle in such a beautiful way, and the ways that it still sort of has it leaves a long shadow for later in your life. And I think that's so well articulated in this novel. And we sort of see this idea kind of, she sort of, there's this sort of idea that this sort of motif of this keeps on appearing in her artwork. And what is kind of cool about that, I think, for this is sort of this idea of the artist as a sum of their experiences, but not necessarily always conscious. Because later in the book, we have a moment where she sort of, lots of her memories come back, and she sort of suddenly has to deal with everything that's gone on in her life and all of those sorts of things. So I think this is really, this is sort of, yeah, in many ways, Atwood doing some of her just some incredible work in terms of sort of personal narrative of following one person and really getting inside their head, which I think is actually often where Atwood is at her best, when she's really, really inside the head of one person. And I think it also is just kind of an interesting book about art and about so many other things as well. So I did really enjoy it overall. Not my favourite Atwood, but that's just because there are so many Atwood books that I absolutely adore. But I still think a really good, solid shortlisting here as well. Next up, a book I spoke about fairly recently, John Banville's The Book of Evidence. So this is essentially based on a real person. And there is also, there was a book recently that also spoke a bit about this, of sort of really trying to get inside the head of this man who was there in Dublin and committed some horrific acts. And the real life man sort of was this very odd figure, because he committed a few murders that seemed even more senseless than murders typically would be. This wasn't a thing of revenge. This wasn't a thing of, trying to get a certain thing. It was basically, he wanted to do this thing, to do that, something else happened. He killed someone to get a car, even though he didn't need to kill them. It just all, and these were exceptionally brutal. And so all of these things happened, and this sort of real life man then still carried on living in Dublin and was often seen around town, and people would say, would sort of go up to him and confront him and say, how dare you show your face around here? John Banville in The Book of Evidence sort of riffs on this and basically creates what then actually turns out to be, I think, a series of 3 novels, sort of that are preoccupied with this man in some capacity. And so The Book of Evidence in many ways follows that. It's an attempt to try to understand this character. However, in this book, it's all told through the narrative of this man who has done unspeakable things. He's sort of, he sort of talks about how he does various things. He will, and in his mind, there's sort of almost like an internal logic of, oh, well, I couldn't go and do this thing here, so I went over here and I killed someone. And in his mind, that entirely makes sense. But we as the readers can absolutely see that his sense of reality is not the same as ours. And this sort of unreliable nature of his writing, I think, makes a really interesting novel, because it kind of gives him the space to be able to talk quite in depth about the sort of, almost his attempts to justify, or even at times not to justify, and to just sort of say, well, it's not that big a deal. And actually all of that makes him this really complex character, because he does not show penance in the way that we almost expect our villains in books to show. And so he just sort of ends the novel still mostly unchanged. And as a result, it's a very strange perspective to have this sort of, there's no real comeuppance. There's no real sense of justice in some ways in the book. And I think that's what's so fascinating about it. Next up, we have Jigsaw by Sybille Bedford. And this is a novel that in many ways is sort of semi-autobiographical even. And it kind of has this very interesting sort of way of approaching that, because we sort of know from the beginning that this is mostly non-fiction, but it's kind of told in this very sort of novel-like style. And we basically watch as a young woman in various boarding schools and sort of various places, sort of moving around bits of Europe, comes to understand her own identity, and part of that identity is her sexuality. And it's interesting actually because so Edmund White was one of the judges this year, and petitioned fairly hard. I think I saw this in an interview on Eric's channel over at Lonesome Reader, that he sort of basically pushed quite hard to make sure that there was a queer voice on the shortlist. And so this book is sort of here as a result. I have to admit, it's not my favourite on the shortlist. I did struggle with this book. I think I found it a little slow. I think what is going on in the book in terms of her actual personal story, I think is a really impressive story. And it's really interesting, her perceptions and her insights about her own self and her identity and her parents and all these other things. I think I just found it a little bit slow, and I just could never quite find an angle on it. But still, nonetheless, it's a perspective that we don't often get, really. There's sort of a young lesbian, essentially, or young girl who likes women, dealing with sort of addiction within her family, but also sort of told in this very, this is not a novel where she's sort of seeking pity or what have you. There's a sort of real strength in sort of slowly coming to the realizations about herself that I think make it quite profound. I think I just didn't necessarily always get on with it, but I think ultimately the story that's at the heart of this is a really important one, and is really well done, but just not for me, I think, as well. And next we have James Kelman with a Disaffection, and this is a book that, so you know, his book that would later go on to win the Booker, How Late It Was, How Late is a book that is also told in this sort of vernacular of this sort of very strong Glasgow dialect, and there's something really powerful about the way this sort of bursts through. There's a real energy to this book. And it is told, especially as well in this case, in a stream of consciousness style, which also means that you get this kind of intensity of just thoughts and thoughts and thoughts. And he is a young man who is a teacher, and he is just, he's not particularly happy. The disaffection in the title is basically most of his life. He doesn't like where he is. He sort of likes his job, but most of his thoughts at his job are about another teacher who he fancies, but she's married and also isn't that interested. And he just sort of plods along, but basically various bits of the machinery of the school system seem to work against him, or at least he feels like he's being conspired against to leave. But the kind of way he plods along is this sort of malaise. Nothing is particularly happy in his life. You know, he might sort of get a glance from the woman he fancies, and you know, he kind of just wants to do all these things, and yet none of it really comes to fruition. He never quite gets there. And so I think that's the thing I found really interesting here, is he sort of just he just sort of plods along. Nothing really happens, nothing really goes his way, and it kind of just ends. And although that sounds like it's going to be a depressing novel, and in some ways parts of it are, there's something also quite funny and quite profound about the way it's done, I think, where he's able to be this sort of, not necessarily dropout, but this kind of like person who's just sort of failing on multiple fronts. And in many ways there's something it captures that I think is so real, that is sort of very very interesting. And I just thought this was really, really well done in many ways. And even if it's not always the most enjoyable read in that sense, there's something very interesting going on under the hood, I think, of this book. And last but not least, we have Restoration by Rose Tremain. And in many ways, this is one of her more famous books from what I understand. And so yeah, the core idea is we follow this sort of man in the time of Charles II of England, and he is so yeah, sort of 1660 to 1685, and he is this sort of odd figure because he essentially is sort of he's a doctor to the king, and sort of gains his notoriety, or medical student, but he gains his notoriety by curing a pet dog owned by the king, and this is his sort of way of announcing himself. And from there on, it kind of turns into this set of things happening, his sort of life of trying to work his way through kind of court politics of, you know, will he the royal court, like will he find himself killed, will he find himself sort of shunned if he does anything wrong. There's a sort of sense of the sort of fickleness of being loved by the crown, you know, that you do anything wrong and you're out, and everybody's sort of jostling for power and all these sorts of things. So it's this sort of very strange set of things. It's a very weird book in many ways. So typically historical fiction isn't always my thing, and I was a little bit nervous about that going in, and I think actually it wears some of that part fairly lightly, as in it's mostly this very strange story at the heart of it. It's a bit of a weird one, but also quite fun. Like it's kind of we sort of learn a lot about these kind of characters as they sort of plod along, and it's absurd, it's silly, it's strange and wild, but at the same time I think an enjoyable book. I struggled with it a little bit more generally, just because I think I never fully found a foothold in the book. But I think that is me in historical fiction generally. It's quite rare that a book really can kind of get me within sort of historical fiction kind of the same way. But that said, I think this is a very enjoyable book. It's very some of the silly moments of this book are just so wild and stupid, but in like in the best possible way, of just you know, the kind of absurdity of the royal court, and particularly of medicine at that time. You know, the sorts of things that people are suggesting. As a modern reader, you're like, this makes no sense, why would anyone do this? And can be kind of fun. But yeah, I think it's sort of, this was a book that, you know, was a beloved one of hers, and there's a film version which I'm actually tempted to watch, because I think I might get more out of it perhaps than I did with the book. But also just, yeah, kind of a wild book. And that takes us to the end of the shortlist. So as you've probably been able to tell just from my general enthusiasm about the books on this list, I think, you know, The Remains of the Day is far and away my favourite on this list. I think it's a fantastic book. I love the subtlety of the writing, in that we're allowed to sort of live inside the head of someone who has a very specific point of view, and whilst also knowing as the readership that we can disagree with him. And I think that's a very sort of controlled narrative in a really clever way. But I will also say the Book of Evidence and Cat's Eye, I think, are also just really interesting books, and I can absolutely see why they were shortlisted. It's also interesting, actually, just looking at it now as a shortlist. This is a very, very British and Irish shortlist, which doesn't happen that often. I mean, it did a lot more in the 80s and 90s, but here, I think especially, you know, this is a list where Margaret Atwood, if I'm right, is the only one outside of the UK and Ireland. As she often is in these lists, actually, it has to be said. She sort of pops up as one of the only non-British or Irish authors. But I think Cat's Eye is one of those ones that I've seen so many people absolutely adore. I think the way she talks about memory is so beautiful. And actually, this is a shortlist that's very heavy on memory and talking about it. Jigsaw, Cat's Eye, and The Remains of the Day are all really preoccupied with memory and looking back in a really fascinating way. But yeah, I think The Remains of the Day would still be my absolute winner from this. But yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these books. Which ones would you personally have as winners from this? I kind of was almost hoping that my birthday year would have more books that I would really love and really want to sort of be behind. But also, you know, such is the way with shortlists and with rotating panels of judges. They're not always going to be people who have the same interests as you. But with all that said, I'll carry on doing this. I think this Booker project of mine should actually maybe finish this year, which is surreal. And I'll keep going from there. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.